The heavy oak front door of my estate stood wide open. A black Uber SUV idled loudly in my circular driveway. I was sitting in a medical-grade steel wheelchair in the foyer. 3 days ago, I had survived a collision on Interstate 95. A distracted teenager hauling a trailer had clipped the rear axle of my sedan. The violent impact had severely fractured my right hip and shattered my collarbone. The surgeons had mandated 6 weeks of total immobile recovery. My biological son, Bradley, was not looking at my bandaged shoulder. He was looking at his gold Rolex. "We are going to miss the final boarding call, Chloe," Bradley snapped, dragging 2 genuine Louis Vuitton suitcases toward the doorway. Chloe, my 36-year-old daughter-in-law, adjusted her designer sunglasses. She let out an irritated sigh. "Dad," Bradley said, turning to face my wheelchair. His voice lacked any ounce of human empathy. "The home care nurse starts tomorrow morning. There is prep-cooked food in the refrigerator. You're fine. Do not attempt to guilt-trip us into canceling this trip." "It is a Category 4 medical recovery, Bradley," I said quietly. My voice was raspy from the intubation tubes. "The doctors strictly require a family proxy physically present in the house for the first 72 hours. Blood clots are a lethal probability." Chloe rolled her manicured eyes behind her dark lenses. "Thomas," she said, "this Aruba resort package is entirely non-refundable. We have been planning this elite getaway for 9 months. We cannot pause our vibrant lives just because you had a driving incident. Our vacation comes first." I stared at her. Then I stared at my son. I shouldn't have been surprised. The warning signs of their toxic entitlement had been obvious for years. Last Christmas, Bradley stood in my formal dining room, swirling my reserve scotch. He loudly bragged to my neighbors about how he was a self-made entrepreneur. He completely ignored the indisputable fact that I alone had secretly secured the primary capital for his failing logistics firm. He basically viewed me as a decaying ghost inhabiting a house he was eager to inherit. Now, he was literally leaving me alone with fresh surgical wounds to sit on a beach. "Let's go," Bradley barked, completely turning his back on me. "The driver's running the meter." They walked out into the afternoon sunlight. They didn't say goodbye. The heavy oak door slammed shut with terrible finality. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for them to return. I didn't reach for my prescribed painkillers to dull the agony. I rolled my wheelchair backward. I manually navigated down the hallway toward my climate-controlled study. I locked the heavy double doors firmly behind me. I didn't call the police. I didn't call social services. I opened my encrypted master terminal. Bradley clearly thought I was just an outdated senior citizen whose failing health was an annoying inconvenience. He had entirely forgotten that I spent 40 brutal years as the Chief Corporate Liquidator for Vanguard Securities. I didn't just cut off monthly allowances when people disappointed me. I completely and mercilessly dismantled their existence. "My name is Thomas Harrison. I'm 72 years old. I do not play bingo. I do not complete crossword puzzles. My entire professional life has been dedicated to the precise mathematical destruction of failing entities. When massive corporations went bankrupt due to sheer executive arrogance, I was the man the central banks called. I would walk into a towering skyscraper, seize the primary ledgers, fire the entitled executives, and liquidate the tangible assets down to the very last office chair. I know exactly how to turn a wealthy man into a beggar within 24 hours, and right now, the most bloated, deeply mismanaged entity in my life was my own son. I wheeled myself slowly toward my mahogany desk. The physical pain radiating from my hip was immense, but the psychological coldness spreading in my chest completely overrode it. I booted up my primary trading terminal. The ultra-wide monitors flared to life. Bradley loved to publicly boast about his incredible business acumen at the local country club. He drove a customized, fully loaded Range Rover. Chloe wore organic yoga pants and exclusively carried Hermes bags. They lived in an immense 6-bedroom colonial house in one of the most exclusive gated communities in the suburbs. The pathetic truth was that Bradley's logistics company had effectively failed 3 years ago. He was technically and legally insolvent. To spare him the horrific public humiliation of declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy, I had quietly established a heavily insulated, revocable blind trust. Every single month on the first day of the calendar, my automated trust actively deposited exactly $14,000 into Bradley's corporate account under the fabricated guise of external freight consulting fees. That phantom $14,000 paid for the Range Rover lease. It paid for the colonial house. It paid for the expensive, non-refundable resort in Aruba. I alone was the foundation holding up the fragile glass house of their self-made fantasy. My fingers moved carefully across the mechanical keyboard. I accessed the Vanguard Private Wealth Management portal. I navigated directly to the master routing controls for the Harrison Revocable Blind Trust. The monthly distribution was scheduled to initiate the automated wire transfer in exactly 48 hours. Bradley had just told me his vacation absolutely came first. He firmly believed his structural security was guaranteed. The execution protocol was now required. I moved the cursor over the active distribution schedule. I bypassed the warning prompts. I permanently deleted the recurring wire transfer. I didn't just pause the phantom payments. I formally closed the blind trust entirely, permanently reabsorbing the capital. The lethal injection was administered. Now, I merely had to wait to watch the financial poison reach his heart. Bradley's breathtaking arrogance had not developed overnight. It was the result of a slow, cancerous entitlement that had festered over the last decade. He had deeply internalized the belief that extreme wealth was an unconditional birthright, requiring zero actual labor or basic moral decency. 2 months prior to my accident, I had invited myself over to his luxurious home to review his quarterly corporate numbers. I had specifically requested that he prepare the active profit and loss statements. I wanted to see if my massive financial life support was actually helping him rebuild his business. When I arrived at the colonial house, he didn't have the ledgers prepared. He was actively lounging by his oversized saltwater pool, surrounded by 4 of his equally entitled neighborhood friends. Thomas, Chloe had greeted me coldly. She was holding a tall crystal glass filled with imported champagne. Bradley is currently entertaining highly important clients. You really shouldn't just drop by unannounced. It looks terribly unprofessional. I'm his primary investor, I'd replied, my tone flat. I do not need an engraved invitation to inspect my own capital. Bradley lazily stood up from his sun lounger. He didn't offer me a seat. He walked over, reeking of expensive cologne. Dad, chill out, Bradley whispered aggressively, grabbing my arm. The logistics market is experiencing a slight seasonal dip. Don't embarrass me in front of these guys. They think I'm clearing 7 figures organically. Just keep the consulting checks clearing, and I'll send you the spreadsheets by the 4th quarter. He had actually believed his own ridiculous lie, and he had convinced himself my charity was his personal achievement. I looked at the active transaction monitors glowing steadily on my right. I maintained total viewing permissions on his primary corporate checking account. I executed a real-time refresh. The terminal displayed a brand new pending charge. Exactly 20 minutes ago, while physically en route to the international airport in their Uber, Chloe had casually swiped his primary business platinum card. She had spent exactly $4,200 at a high-end duty-free luxury boutique located in Terminal B. She purchased an overpriced handbag just for the completely superficial photo opportunities in Aruba. They were actively continuing to bleed the corpse of his dead company, fully expecting my automated $14,000 deposit to magically resurrect them. The absolute zero temperature radiating in my chest finalized into unshakable ice. You do not abandon your severely injured father to fly to a tropical island. You do not disrespect the sole architect of your entire fake existence. The physical pain in my shattered collarbone throbbed intensely. I firmly ignored it. The corporate audit was officially complete. The merciless liquidation phase had now begun. I reached for my encrypted private cellular phone, sitting gracefully on the edge of the mahogany desk. I scrolled through the restricted contact list and dialed a number located directly in the financial district of Manhattan. The loud, ringing tone lasted exactly 3 seconds. Sterling Wealth Management, Executive Director's Office. Henry speaking, the deep, commanding voice stated. Henry Sterling was 68 years old. He was a highly ruthless, sharply dressed former corporate raider. More importantly, he was my former top lieutenant during my aggressive tenure at Vanguard Securities. We had spent decades hunting down and bankrupting corrupt CEOs together. He was completely, fiercely loyal to exactly one man on earth. Me. Henry, I said quietly. It's Thomas Harrison. Thomas? And you stubborn old bastard, Henry's voice immediately warmed. I heard about the pileup on Age 95. The board members were terrified you'd finally checked out. Are you intact? I'm severely fractured but fully operational from the terminal, I replied smoothly. However, I currently require a specific, immediate structural demolition. The silence from Henry was deeply professional. The friendly banter was permanently terminated. What is the exact target, Thomas? Henry asked, his tone turning into pure steel. The target is the Harrison Revocable Blind Trust, I stated firmly, and the dependent entity known as Bradley Harrison Logistics. Your own son, Henry asked. There wasn't a shred of judgment in his voice, only tactical calculation. The phantom consulting structure we built to hide his insolvency? Bradley and Chloe chose to completely abandon me in this house to attend a luxury vacation in Aruba while I recover from major surgery, I briefed him. They firmly believe their financial security is completely unconditional. I see, Henry said simply. The coldness in his voice could have frozen a river. What are my exact executive orders? I have already manually severed the automated monthly distributions, I commanded, staring at the blue glow of my monitors. I want you to formally execute the immediate clawback clause buried in his corporate loan agreements. Bradley owes the primary holding company exactly $450,000 in deferred structural debt. Call the debt in immediately. Due in full within 24 hours. I heard the rapid clicking of Henry's mechanical keyboard. The debt call will actively trigger an absolute default on his end, Henry confirmed, reviewing the legal documents. His corporate accounts will be frozen by the central bank before midnight. His platinum cards will decline globally. He will be locked out of his own life. That's exactly the point, I said evenly. He proudly claimed he is a self-made man. Let's legally test that theory. Burn the entire bridge to the ground, Henry. Consider it ashes, Thomas, Henry replied. The legal notices are transmitting right now. I severed the connection. I placed the phone back on the desk. 48 long, incredibly painful hours crawled by in absolute silence. The professional home care nurse arrived. She changed my surgical bandages, administered the prescribed antibiotics, and ensured my fractured hip remained completely immobile. The house was extremely quiet. The vast emptiness was occasionally terrifying, but I focused entirely on the glowing screens in my private study. It was a brilliantly sunny Tuesday afternoon in the Caribbean. Bradley and Chloe had successfully flown to Aruba. Based on his previous loud brags, I knew they were scheduled to officially check into the Grand Azure Resort at exactly 3 p.m. local time. The penthouse suite there cost $1,500 per night, actively requiring a massive upfront security authorization hold upon arrival. I watched the clock on my master terminal slowly hit 3:15 p.m. My private cell phone suddenly vibrated violently. The caller ID displayed Bradley's name in bright red letters. I let it ring 3 complete times to perfectly heighten his anxiety. Then, I calmly pressed the green accept button and engaged the speakerphone. "Hello, Bradley," I said. My voice was perfectly flat. "Dad!" Bradley yelled. The background noise was incredibly chaotic. I could hear the faint sound of tropical music, combined with the sharp hissing of his wife, swearing heavily. "Dad, contact the private bank right now. My corporate platinum card is totally malfunctioning. We are standing at the front desk of the Azure Resort, and the concierge is aggressively rejecting the authorization hold. There is absolutely no malfunction with the banking servers." "Bradley," I stated smoothly. "What the hell are you talking about?" he screamed. His voice echoed with raw entitlement. "The teller just told the manager my accounts are completely frozen. They said an external debt covenant was forcefully triggered. This is extremely embarrassing. Chloe is literally crying in the lobby. Fix it." "I cannot fix it," I said coolly. "I am the one who triggered it." Complete deafening silence fell over the cellular connection. The loud tropical music in the background seemed to fade away. "You did what?" Bradley whispered, his voice trembling. "I securely logged into the Vanguard master terminal," I meticulously explained, treating him strictly like a hostile asset. "I permanently deleted the $14,000 phantom consulting deposit. And then, I ordered my wealth manager to immediately call in your $450,000 deferred corporate debt." You can't do that," he shrieked loudly. His panic was absolute. "Dad, we are stuck in Aruba. We have absolutely no money. My account balance literally says negative zeros. We can't even pay for the Uber back to the stupid airport. You are completely ruining my entire life." "I am absolutely not ruining you, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing low baritone. "You are a totally self-made, independent entrepreneur. A self-made man does not rely on his mutilated father's capital to fund a luxury vacation." "Dad, please," he begged violently. "They are threatening to call resort security on us." "You are currently trespassing in Aruba on my dime, Bradley," I commanded quietly, severing all emotional ties forever. "Have a wonderful, terrifying flight back home in standard coach." I hung up the phone. I didn't wait for his screams. I placed the cellular phone gently onto the mahogany desk. The profound silence in my massive study had never felt more serene. The excruciating physical pain in my fractured collarbone seemed to significantly dull the moment I officially initiated the ruthless liquidation protocol against my own flesh and blood. The following morning, precisely at 9 a.m., my phone rang again. "Henry," I said, entirely skipping the standard greetings. "Thomas," Henry Sterling replied, his deep voice carrying the satisfied tone of a devastating corporate raid. "The financial demolition of Bradley Harrison Logistics is progressing far faster than our initial models projected. His entire structure was fundamentally built on quicksand." "Give me the exact metrics, Henry," I commanded, pulling up my secondary monitoring terminal. His corporate accounts completely locked down at midnight," Henry meticulously reported. "This instantly rejected every single auto draft scheduled for this morning. His Range Rover lease payments severely bounced. His country club membership dues heavily bounced. He is officially delinquent." I watched the red error codes populating across the secret master ledger. "And the primary residential asset?" I asked quietly. "This is the sheer beauty of his total incompetence, Thomas," Henry chuckled. 3 years ago, when you initially bailed him out, Bradley aggressively leveraged his 6-bedroom colonial house strictly as temporary collateral against the corporate loan structure. He foolishly assumed you would never call the debt in. He tied his personal shelter directly to his failing business. "Execute the immediate residential foreclosure protocol," I stated firmly. I already enthusiastically filed the preliminary paperwork with the local county court at dawn, Henry confirmed. Because the debt is actively tied to a total corporate default of $450,000, we legally bypassed the standard grace period. At this exact moment, armed county sheriff's deputies are physically arriving at the colonial property. They are placing bright orange padlocks on the massive front doors. Bradley was completely, irrevocably homeless. How did he manage to survive in Aruba? I asked, a tiny sliver of morbid curiosity breaking through. He apparently spent 5 intense hours frantically calling every single friend who aggressively drank his expensive scotch by his pool, Henry noted dryly. None of them wanted to physically loan a bankrupt man $1,500. Eventually, Chloe's deeply embarrassed mother angrily wired them exactly $800 via Western Union. Just enough capital to forcibly buy 2 miserable standby tickets on an extremely late-night budget airline. Bradley, the self-proclaimed successful logistics mogul, was currently flying home in coach, completely funded by his mother-in-law. "Excellent work, Henry," I said softly. "The trap is totally shut." It took them exactly 4 miserable days to finally show up at my heavily fortified front door. I was sitting comfortably in my medical wheelchair in the front foyer when the loud, chaotic pounding began. It wasn't the confident knocking of a wealthy son. It was the frantic, desperate hammering of a terrified man out of options. "Dad!" Bradley screamed through the thick oak door. "Dad, open the damn door right now. You have to help us." I manually engaged the master wall panel. I slowly unlocked the heavy steel deadbolt. I didn't physically open the door. I forced him to turn the heavy brass handle himself. Bradley and Chloe aggressively spilled into my quiet foyer. They looked completely destroyed. The fake wealthy entrepreneur aesthetic was utterly shattered. Bradley was severely sunburned, while wearing extremely wrinkled airport sweatpants and a cheap souvenir t-shirt. His hair was greasy. Chloe was frantically clutching her massive Louis Vuitton bag, crying heavily, her expensive mascara running in dark streaks down her face. Outside, idling roughly in my large circular driveway, was a heavily dented compact Kia rental car. The customized luxury Range Rover was conspicuously missing. "My house!" Bradley shrieked, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my face. He was practically hyperventilating. "Dad, we finally got an Uber from the terrifying budget airport, and we drove to the Colonial. There are massive orange locks on the doors. There is an official county sheriff's eviction notice heavily taped to the windows." "I am completely aware of the legal status of the massive property, Bradley," I replied, my voice carrying the freezing temperature of a morgue. As the primary lion holder of the defaulted corporate debt, I legally initiated the foreclosure proceedings. "You aggressively stole my house," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You stranded us in a foreign country, and then you stole the house I heavily worked for." "You never actively worked for that house," I corrected him violently, cutting straight through his terrified delusions. "You heavily relied on a fake phantom $14,000 monthly consulting fee generated by my blind trust. You lived entirely in a synthetic financial bubble. I simply reached out and popped it." Chloe stared vehemently at me. Her wide eyes were darting rapidly. She looked completely terrified. "Thomas," she pleaded, dropping the massive designer bag onto the hardwood floor. It landed with a pathetic thud. "Thomas, please." My own platinum credit cards were violently declined at the tiny airport kiosk. My personal car was aggressively repossessed from the country club parking lot this morning. They took the Mercedes. You have to immediately fix the terrible bank glitch. You cannot do this to our vibrant lives. "There is no highly secret bank glitch, Chloe," I stated firmly, refusing to offer her even an ounce of shallow pity. "He owes my primary holding company exactly $450,000. The merciless liquidation phase is active. Bradley physically grabbed his own greasy hair in absolute shock. He stumbled backward, leaning completely against the wall to desperately keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. "You are a total monster," Bradley whispered aggressively, tears of sheer rage and helplessness spilling from his bloodshot eyes. "You are my own father, and you totally ruined me just because I went on a vacation." "I did not forcefully ruin you because you went on a vacation," I said quietly, the terrifying truth finally dropping heavily into the room. "I completely destroyed your fake financial structure because you violently abandoned a severely injured elderly man to sit alone in a massive house simply because you felt entitled to my endless charity." I reached into the side pocket of my medical wheelchair. I pulled out a thick, legally binding manila folder stamped with the Vanguard corporate seal. I tossed it effortlessly onto the small entrance table. "Those are the highly official financial liquidation documents," I announced coldly. "They clearly show the massive extent of your absolute failure. You have absolutely zero equity left in any remaining physical asset. Your fake logistics corporate accounts are totally empty. Your credit score is completely destroyed. You are mathematically, legally, and entirely bankrupt." Chloe slowly walked over to the small table. Her shaking hands cautiously picked up the heavy folder. She rapidly, specifically scanned the front page, her eyes actively searching for the massive bank account balances she mistakenly thought her husband actually possessed. She saw the massive red negative zeros. She slowly turned her absolute attention to Bradley. The terrified expression on her face rapidly warped into pure, unadulterated disgust. "You lied to me," Chloe hissed aggressively, her voice dripping with sheer venom. "Chloe, babe, wait!" Bradley stammered pathetically, reaching out a desperate hand toward her. "I can quickly fix this. I just aggressively need a tiny bridge loan from the country club guys. Just give me a few short weeks to hustle." "You are not a highly successful CEO," Chloe explicitly spat the terrifying words directly into his face. "You are literally just a massive, pathetic allowance, baby. You never actually had a profitable company. You were just aggressively spending your father's heavy charity. Bait, and you incredibly foolishly pushed him far too hard." The absolute betrayal in Bradley's eyes was magnificent to witness. The woman he actively bought massive designer bags for was brutally turning on him the absolute second the deep financial well ran entirely dry. Chloe didn't hesitate. She didn't offer to violently stand by her terrified husband in his incredibly dark hour. She bent down, aggressively picked up her single remaining Louis Vuitton bag, and aggressively pulled out her cracked cell phone to frantically order an Uber. "I am actively going to my mother's small condo in the city," she announced coldly, not even looking directly at Bradley. "Do not strongly attempt to call me. My highly aggressive divorce attorney will absolutely contact you regarding the formal separation paperwork on Monday morning." "Chloe, please," Bradley begged violently, grabbing her arm. She aggressively shook him completely off. She physically walked out of the heavy oak doors, completely abandoning him in the exact same cold, heartless manner they had both completely abandoned me just 4 short days prior. Bradley stood entirely alone in my massive foyer. He looked incredibly small. His broad shoulders were completely slumped. The massive arrogance that had defined his entire annoying existence had been surgically amputated without anesthesia. "Dad," he whispered pathetically, falling heavily to his knees on the hardwood floor. He aggressively clasped his hands together in pure begging desperation. "Please, I have absolutely nowhere else to go. The massive colonial house is heavily locked down. Chloe completely left me. I have absolutely zero money for basic groceries. Just give me my incredibly old childhood bedroom upstairs. Just give me an absolute entry-level job in your massive asset firm. I will actively work in the mailroom, please." I looked down at the terrified, destroyed man actively crying on my floor. I felt absolutely precisely nothing. "I am officially retired, Bradley," I said quietly, the absolute authority in my voice sealing his terrible fate. "I absolutely do not aggressively hire heavily bankrupt liabilities, and I do not forcefully employ disloyal employees." "Where am I supposed to physically sleep?" he screamed wildly, the pure terror completely taking over his mind. "That is the harsh beauty of being a highly self-made independent entrepreneur," I replied coldly. "You get to completely figure out those terrifying challenges entirely by yourself. Get out of my secure estate. Now." I firmly pressed the electronic master button on the wall. The massive, heavy oak doors slowly hummed open, vividly revealing the long, incredibly empty aggregate driveway. Bradley knew the absolute coldness in my eyes. Not he heavily understood that begging was completely, utterly useless when facing a veteran corporate liquidator. He slowly, pathetically hauled himself entirely to his feet. He heavily dragged his small feet out of the house, getting actively into the cheap, heavily dented Kia rental car. I severely watched the tiny taillights aggressively disappear entirely down the dark suburban street. I pressed the wall button. The heavy steel deadbolts aggressively slammed shut. Exactly 6 incredibly long months later, the cold, harsh suburban winter had entirely thawed. The heavy medical cast had been completely, safely removed from my shattered collarbone. The fractured hip had miraculously healed correctly. I was fully walking effortlessly around my massive estate, completely free of any restricting medical canes or wheelchairs. The massive legal proceedings deeply regarding the Harrison Revocable Blind Trust were violently conclusive. Bradley had aggressively attempted to desperately declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy solely to illegally protect his seized massive colonial house. Henry Sterling's massive fleet of aggressive corporate lawyers entirely crushed the pathetic motion in federal court in exactly under 20 minutes. The massive colonial was completely liquidated at a public county auction. Chloe had successfully fully finalized their aggressive divorce. She relentlessly took 50% of the completely zero assets he incredibly briefly possessed, leaving him drowning heavily in massive unavoidable legal fees. The offshore country club friends had completely, predictably abandoned him the absolute split second his elite membership severely bounced. The incredibly last status report I actively received entirely indicated that Bradley was heavily working grueling 50-hour shifts as a low-level warehouse forklift operator located on the bad side of town. He was using every single heavy, exhausting paycheck simply to pay the brutal interest on his massive, unavoidable personal debts. He finally, successfully achieved his lifelong dream. He was entirely, undeniably a self-made working man. It was a brilliantly quiet, massive Sunday morning. I was sitting comfortably on the heavy leather chair in my private, climate-controlled study. Outside the massive reinforced windows, the elite neighborhood was incredibly, profoundly peaceful. The terrible memory of his aggressive arrogance was a completely erased echo. The grand ledger was perfectly, beautifully balanced. I deliberately logged out of the highly secure Vanguard Master Network. I decisively closed out the massive blue command prompt. I locked my computer system, stood up slowly, and walked down the long, hardwood hallway to the bright kitchen to manually make a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. Revenge is a notoriously messy, horrific business for emotional amateurs. For a seasoned corporate liquidator, it is simply a matter of identifying the heavily corrupted internal asset, or coldly isolating the dangerous liability and calmly demanding the outstanding principal. I watched the silver kettle boil quietly on the expensive stove. No one was aggressively screaming inside my massive house. No one was arrogantly demanding my capital. I'm a simple 72-year-old retired corporate liquidator, and my massive house is completely blissfully quiet.